Hi everyone, it's Cassie, the Young Teen Librarian at East Hampton Library. Tonight we are continuing with reading through Cheaper by the Dozen, and we are continuing with Chapter 4, which is entitled Visiting Mrs. Murphy. Roads weren't marked very well in those days, and Dad never believed in signs anyway. Probably some kid has changed those arrows around, he would say, possibly remembering his own youth. Seems to me that if we turned that way, the way the arrow says, we'd be headed right back where we came from. The same thing happened with the Automobile Blue Book, the tourist's Bible in the early days of the automobile. Mother would read to him, 6/10 of the mile past windmill, bear left at Brick Church and follow paved road. That must be the wrong windmill, Dad would say. No telling when the fellow who wrote that book came over this road to check up on things. My bump of direction tells me to turn right. They must have torn down the windmill the book's talking about. Then, after he'd turned right and gotten lost, he'd blame Mother for giving him the wrong directions. Several times he called Anne up to the front seat to read the blue book for him. Your mother hasn't a very good sense of direction, he'd say loudly, glaring over his pince-nez at Mother. She tells me to turn left when the book says to turn right. Then she blames me when we get lost. Now you read it to me just like it says. Don't change a single word, understand? And don't be making up anything about windmills that aren't there or non-existent brick churches just to confuse me. Read it just like it says. But he wouldn't follow Anne's directions either, and so he'd get lost just the same. When things looked hopeless, Dad would ask directions at a store or filling station. He'd listen, and then usually drive off in exactly the opposite direction from the one his informant had indicated. Old fool, Dad would mutter. He's lived 5 miles from Trenton all his life, and he doesn't even know how to get there. He's trying to route me back to New York. Mother was philosophical about it. Whenever she'd considered that Dad was hopelessly lost, she'd open a little portable ice box that she kept on the floor of the car under her feet and hand Jane her bottle. This was Mother's signal that it was time to have lunch. All right, Lily, Dad would say. Guess we might as well stop and eat while I get my bearings. You pick out a good place for a picnic. While we were eating, Dad would keep looking around for something that might be interesting. He was a natural teacher and believed in utilizing every minute. Eating, he said, was unavoidable delay. So were dressing, face washing, and hair combing. Unavoidable delay was not to be wasted. If Dad found an anthill, he'd tell us about certain colonies of ants that kept slaves and herds of cows. Then we'd take turns lying on our stomachs, watching the ants go back and forth, picking up crumbs from sandwiches. See, they all work and they don't waste anything, Dad would say. And you could tell that the ant was one of his favorite creatures. Look at the teamwork as 4 of them try to move that piece of meat. That's motion study for you. Or he'd point out a stone wall and say it was a perfect example of engineering. He'd explain about how the glaciers passed over the earth many years ago and left the stone when they melted. If a factory was nearby, he'd explain how you used a plumb line to get the chimney straight and why the windows had been placed a certain way to let in the maximum light. If the factory whistle blew, he'd take out his stopwatch and time the difference between when the steam appeared and when we heard the sound. Now take out your notebooks and pencils and I'll show you how to figure the speed of sound, he'd say. He insisted that we make a habit of using our eyes and ears every single minute. Look there, he'd say. What do you see? Yes, I know it's a tree. But look at it. Study it. What do you see? But it was Mother who spun the stories that made the things we studied really unforgettable. If Dad saw motion study and teamwork in an anthill, Mother saw a highly complex civilization governed, perhaps, by a fat old queen who had 1,000 black slaves bring her breakfast in bed on mornings. If Dad stopped to explain the construction of a bridge, she would find the workman in his blue jeans eating his lunch high on the top of the span. It was she who made us feel the breathless height of the structure and the relative puniness of the humans who had built it. Or if Dad pointed out a tree that had been bent and gnarled, It was Mother who made us sense how the wind, eating against the tree in the endless passing of time, had made its own relentless mark. We'd sit there memorizing every word, and Dad would look at Mother as if he were sure he had married the most wonderful person in the world. Before we left our picnic site, Dad would insist that all of the sandwich wrappings and other trash be carefully gathered, stowed in the lunchbox, and brought home for disposal. "If there's anything I can't stand, it's a sloppy camper," he'd say. "We don't want to leave a single scrap of paper on this man's property. We're going to leave things just like we found them, only even more so. We don't want to overlook so much as an apple peel." Apple peels were a particularly sore subject. Most of us liked our apples without skins, and Dad thought this was wasteful. When he ate an apple, he consumed skin, core, and seeds, which he alleged were the most healthful and most delectable portions of the fruit. Instead of starting at the side and eating his way around the equator, Dad started at the North Pole and ate down through the core to the south. He didn't actually forbid us to peel our apples or waste the cores, but he kept referring to the matter so as to let us know that he had noticed what we were doing. Sometimes, in order to make sure that we left no rubbish behind, he'd have us form a line, like a company front in the army, and march across the picnic ground. Each of us was expected to pick up any trash in the territory that he covered. The result was that we often came home with the leavings of countless previous picnickers. "I don't see how you children can possibly clutter up a place the way you do," Dad would grin as he stuffed old papers, bottles, and rusty tin cans into the picnic box. "That's not our mess, Daddy. You know that just as well as we do. What would we be doing with empty whiskey bottles and a last year's copy of the Hartford Courant?" "That's what I'd like to know," he'd say, while sniffing the bottles. Neither Dad nor Mother thought filling station toilets were sanitary. They never elaborated about just what diseases the toilets contained, but they made it plain that the ailments were both contagious and dire. In comparison, leprosy would be no worse than a bad cold. Dad always opened the door of a public restroom with his coat tail, and the preparations and precautions that ensued were unavoidable delay in its worst aspect. Once he and Mother had discarded filling stations as a possibility, the only alternative was the woods. Perhaps it was the nervous strain of enduring Dad's driving. Perhaps it was simply that 14 persons have different personal habits. At any rate, we seemed to stop at every promising clump of trees. "I've seen dogs that paid less attention to trees," Dad used to groan. For family delicacy, Dad coined 2 synonyms for going to the bathroom in the woods. One was visiting Mrs. Murphy. The other was examining the rear tire. They meant the same thing. After a picnic, he'd say, "How many have to visit Mrs. Murphy?" Usually no one would, but after we had been underway about 10 or 15 minutes, somebody would announce that he had to go. So Dad would stop the car, and Mother would take the girls into the woods on one side of the road, while Dad took the boys into the woods on the other. "I know every piece of flora and fauna from Bangor, Maine to Washington, D.C., Dad exclaimed bitterly. On the way home, when it was dark, Bill used to crawl up into a swivel seat right behind Dad. Every time Dad was intent on steering while rounding a curve, Bill would reach forward and clutch his arm. Bill was a perfect mimic, and he'd whisper in Mother's voice, "Not so, Frank, not so fast, Frank, not so fast." Dad would think it was Mother grabbing his arm and whispering to him, and he'd make believe he didn't hear her. Sometimes Bill would go into the act when the car was creeping along at a dignified 30, and Dad finally would turn to Mother disgustedly and say, "For the love of Mike, Millie, I was only doing 20. He automatically subtracted 10 miles an hour from the speed whenever he discussed the matter with Mother. "I didn't say anything, Frank," Mother would tell him. Dad would turn around then and see all of us giggling into our handkerchiefs. He'd give Bill a playful cuff and rumple his hair. Secretly, Dad was proud of Bill's imitations. He used to say that when Bill imitated a bird, he, that is Dad, didn't dare to look up. "You'll be the death of me yet, boy," Dad would say to Bill. As we'd roll along, we'd sing 3- and 4-part harmony, with Mother and Dad joining in as soprano and bass. Bobbling Swinging on the Bough, Love's Old Sweet Song, Our Highland Goat, and I've Been Working on the Railroad. What do only children do with themselves, we'd think. Dad would lean back against the seat and cock his hat on the side of his head. Mother would snuggle up against him as if she were cold. The babies were asleep now. Sometimes Mother turned around between songs and said to us, "Right now is the happiest time in the world." And perhaps it was. That is the end of chapter 4, and tomorrow night we will continue with chapter 5. Have a good night.